My name is Victoria Hayes, and for 3 months I mopped floors, filed paperwork, and let arrogant officers treat me like I was barely worth the uniform on my back. They had no idea the woman scrubbing their coffee stains held 2 stars on her actual shoulder boards. I watched them belittle good soldiers, cut corners on protocol, and laugh about it over drinks. I stayed quiet. I documented everything. But the moment Captain Brandon Kerr stood in that dining hall and mocked a Purple Heart recipient to his face, calling him a broken relic who should have stayed in whatever desert he crawled out of, my silence ended. What happened next wasn't revenge. It was accountability. And by the time I was done, half that command structure learned what happens when you mistake patience for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of burnt coffee and floor wax had become so familiar I barely noticed it anymore. I stood in the corner of the administrative office at Fort Davidson, a stack of personnel files balanced against my hip, watching the morning light cut through the dusty blinds in neat horizontal lines. My boots were scuffed. My uniform was regulation but unremarkable. The name tape read Hayes, and beneath it, a single silver bar. First Lieutenant. Nobody looked twice. That was the point. 3 months ago, I'd been sitting in a secured briefing room at the Pentagon, across from Colonel Patricia Owens and 2 stone-faced representatives from the Inspector General's office. The folder they slid across the table was thick, full of incident reports, anonymous complaints, and red flags that had been piling up for over a year. Fort Davidson had a problem. Toxic leadership. Retaliation against whistleblowers. A culture where rank was wielded like a weapon and those at the bottom were expected to take it with a smile. Colonel Owens had looked me in the eye and said it plain. We need someone they won't see coming. Someone who can walk among them, listen, observe, and document without raising suspicion. You'll go in as a lieutenant. Low profile. Administrative assignment. No one will know who you really are except me and the IG team. I'd agreed without hesitation. 22 years in the Army had taught me that sunlight was the best disinfectant, but sometimes you had to go into the dark to find where the rot was growing. So I packed a single duffel bag, left my 2-star rank insignia locked in a safe, and became someone forgettable. The apartment they set me up in was small and plain, a 1-bedroom unit off base with beige walls and a kitchen the size of a closet. I kept it sparse. A futon. A folding table. A coffee maker that sputtered more than it brewed. It was the kind of place a junior officer on a temporary assignment would rent without a second thought. I'd wake up at 0500, put on my uniform, and drive through the gates of Fort Davidson just like everyone else. Nobody saluted me unless I happened to walk past at the same time as a higher-ranking officer. Most days, no one said anything to me at all. The work itself was mind-numbing. Filing reports. Updating duty rosters. Answering phone calls from soldiers trying to get leave approved or find out why their pay was delayed. I'd spent 2 decades leading troops, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives, standing in front of formations and holding people accountable. Now I was answering emails about parking passes. But every tedious task gave me access. Access to records. Access to conversations people had when they thought no one important was listening. Access to the truth. Captain Brandon Kerr was the first name that kept coming up. Brash, mid-30s, the kind of officer who wore his rank like a badge of superiority. He ran the logistics section with an iron fist and a loud mouth. Soldiers under his command walked on eggshells. I'd seen him berate a private first class in the motor pool for leaving a tool on the wrong shelf, his voice echoing across the bay loud enough that everyone stopped working to watch. The kid had apologized, stammered something about being new, and Kerr had leaned in close and said, "New isn't an excuse for being stupid. Figure it out or find another career." No one had said a word. Not the NCOs standing nearby. Not the other officers. They'd all just gone back to work like humiliation was part of the daily routine. Then there was Major Diane Foster. She was quieter than Kerr but just as complicit. She had a talent for looking the other way, for nodding sympathetically when soldiers came to her with concerns and then doing absolutely nothing about it. I'd watched her sit through a meeting where a staff sergeant brought up safety violations in the maintenance yard, legitimate concerns about equipment that hadn't been inspected in months. Foster had smiled, taken notes, and promised to look into it. 2 weeks later, that same staff sergeant was reassigned to a different section with no explanation. The safety issues were never addressed. It was a pattern. Speak up, get moved. Push back, get buried. And the people at the top, the ones who should have been holding the line, were either participating or pretending not to notice. I kept my head down and my ears open. I ate lunch in the dining facility, sitting alone most days, listening to the conversations happening at nearby tables. I stayed late in the office, filing reports that didn't need to be filed, just so I could overhear phone calls and hallway discussions. I made myself invisible, and in doing so, I saw everything. One afternoon, I was walking past the gymnasium when I noticed a small gathering near the entrance. A group of officers stood in a loose circle, laughing about something. I slowed my pace, pretending to check my phone, and caught pieces of the conversation. "You see the new guy in supply?" One of them said. "Looks like he's about 100 years old." Somebody said he's a veteran, like Iraq or something. Lieutenant Kyle Brennan, a young officer barely 2 years out of West Point, smirked. "Probably couldn't hack it in the real army anymore. That's why he's stuck counting staplers." They all laughed. I kept walking, jaw tight, fingers curled into a fist inside my pocket. I didn't know who they were talking about yet, but I made a mental note. Disrespect toward veterans wasn't just unprofessional. It was a window into a deeper problem. 2 days later, I met Sergeant First Class Thomas Ramirez. He was standing in the supply room, methodically organizing boxes of field gear with the kind of precision that only came from years of discipline. He was older, maybe late 50s, with silver streaking through his close-cropped hair and a thin scar that ran along his jawline. He moved carefully, like someone whose body had been through more than it should have. I'd come in to grab a new notebook, something mundane, and he'd looked up and nodded. "Morning, ma'am." "Morning, Sergeant," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I glanced at his uniform. A combat infantryman badge. Airborne wings. And there, just above his left pocket, a purple heart. He noticed me looking and gave a small, tired smile. "Old souvenirs." "Earned," I said quietly. He shrugged, going back to his work. "Long time ago." I left without pressing further, but something about that interaction stayed with me. The way he carried himself. The way he didn't ask for recognition or sympathy. He was just doing his job, the same way he probably had for decades. Over the next few weeks, I saw him around the base. He was always polite, always professional, always in the background. Other soldiers respected him. The younger enlisted troops would ask him questions, and he'd take the time to explain things, patient and thorough. But the officers barely acknowledged him. To them, he was just another NCO past his prime, counting down to retirement. I'd been at Fort Davidson for almost 2 months when I first heard Captain Kerr mention him by name. I was in the break room, pouring a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, when Kerr walked in with Major Foster. They were talking loudly, the way people do when they assume no one important is listening. "That old guy in supply is slowing everything down," Kerr said, pulling a soda from the vending machine. "I asked for an inventory update 3 days ago and he's still puttering around like he's got all the time in the world." Foster sighed. "He's prior enlisted. Combat vet, I think. Probably just riding out his last year." Kerr snorted. "Combat vet. So what? Half these guys claim they're heroes because they sat on a base somewhere and filled sandbags. Doesn't mean he gets a pass for being incompetent." I took a slow sip of my coffee, forcing my expression to stay blank. Kerr didn't even glance my way as he walked out, still complaining. Foster followed, shaking her head but saying nothing. I stood there alone in the break room, staring at the faded motivational poster on the wall. The phrase honor, courage, commitment was printed in bold letters above a picture of soldiers raising a flag. I thought about Sergeant Ramirez, quietly doing his job, carrying the weight of a career most of these officers couldn't begin to understand. And I thought about the men and women who'd served beside him, some of whom never made it home. That night, back in my small apartment, I pulled out my laptop and accessed the secure server where I'd been uploading my reports. I typed slowly, documenting everything I'd heard. The disrespect. The patterns. The names. Colonel Owens would see it all, but I wasn't ready to act yet. I needed more. I needed something undeniable. It came 2 weeks later. The Officers' Club dining hall was packed that Friday evening. It wasn't a formal event, just the usual end-of-week gathering where officers unwound over drinks and mediocre food. I'd shown up because I'd learned that's where the truth came out. People got comfortable. They said things they wouldn't say in uniform during daylight hours. I sat at a small table near the back, nursing a ginger ale and picking at a plate of fries. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter, the clinking of glasses. I wasn't paying attention to anything in particular until I saw Sergeant Ramirez walk in. He was in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple button-down shirt, but he still carried himself like a soldier. He walked to the bar, ordered a water, and took a seat on one of the stools. He wasn't bothering anyone. He was just there, existing in a space he had every right to occupy. Captain Kerr noticed him almost immediately. He was sitting with a group of officers at a large table near the center of the room, already a few drinks in, his voice louder than it needed to be. He nudged Lieutenant Brennan and pointed toward the bar. "Hey, isn't that the supply guy?" Kerr said, loud enough that several nearby tables turned to look. Brennan glanced over and smirked. "Yeah. Guess even relics need a drink." Kerr stood up, swaying slightly, and walked toward the bar. I felt my pulse quicken. I set down my fork and watched. Kerr leaned against the bar next to Ramirez, his posture deliberately casual, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Sergeant Ramirez, right? Didn't expect to see you out and about. Figured you'd be home polishing your medals or something." Ramirez looked at him, calm and measured. "Just grabbing a drink, sir." Kerr grinned. "Sir. I love that. So respectful. You know, I've been meaning to ask, what exactly did you do to earn that Purple Heart? Because I hear a lot of guys got those for stubbing their toe during a mortar drill." The room had started to quiet. People were watching now, sensing something ugly building. Ramirez's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "I was a medic, sir. Helmand Province, 2011. Took shrapnel pulling 2 soldiers out of a vehicle after an IED strike." Kerr tilted his head, mock thoughtful. So you got hurt doing your job. That's what we all sign up for, right? I mean, I don't go around expecting a parade every time I do paperwork." A few people laughed nervously. Ramirez said nothing. He just stared straight ahead, his hands resting on the bar. Kerr wasn't done. "Honestly, Sergeant, I think the problem with guys like you is you get stuck in the past. You did your time, great. But now you're just taking up space. Maybe it's time to admit you're past your prime and let the rest of us actually do the work." The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. I watched Ramirez's face, saw the flicker of pain he tried to hide, the way his shoulders tensed just slightly. He didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. He just picked up his water and stood to leave. That's when I stood up too. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. Every head in the room turned toward me. I walked slowly, deliberately, across the dining hall until I was standing directly in front of Captain Kerr. He looked at me, confused, maybe a little annoyed. "Can I help you, Lieutenant?" I met his eyes, my voice low and cold. "You just publicly humiliated a decorated combat veteran. A man who earned his Purple Heart saving lives while under fire. Do you understand the weight of what you just did? Kerr blinked, clearly not expecting pushback from a junior officer. With all due respect, ma'am, this is a private conversation. It stopped being private the moment you made it a spectacle, I said. And with all due respect, Captain, you're out of line. Major Foster stood up from her table, her expression tight. Lieutenant Hayes, stand down. This isn't your concern. I turned to her, my voice steady. It became my concern the moment an officer in the United States Army disrespected a soldier who bled for this country. The room was dead silent now. Kerr's face had gone red, his hands clenched at his sides. You need to watch your tone, Lieutenant. I didn't move. I didn't blink. And you need to learn what honor looks like. For a long, tense moment, no one said anything. Then I turned to Sergeant Ramirez, who was still standing near the bar, watching with an expression I couldn't quite read. I nodded to him, a small, deliberate gesture of respect. He nodded back. Then I walked out of the officers' club, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Behind me, the murmurs started, quiet at first, then growing louder. I didn't look back. I got in my car, gripped the steering wheel, and let the adrenaline shake through me. It was done. I'd broken cover, not fully, but enough. And now the clock was ticking. I pulled out my phone and typed a single message to Colonel Owens. The drive back to my apartment felt longer than usual. Streetlights flickered past in rhythmic intervals, casting shadows across the dashboard. My hands hadn't stopped trembling since I left the officers' club. Not from fear. From the weight of finally speaking after months of calculated silence. I parked in my usual spot, climbed the concrete stairs to the second floor, and let myself into the quiet emptiness of my temporary home. The futon sat unmade in the corner. A single lamp provided the only light. I dropped my keys on the folding table and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, letting the events of the evening settle into something I could process. My phone buzzed. Colonel Owens. Her response was brief, professional, exactly what I expected. Acknowledged. Stand by for further instructions. Do not deviate from protocol. I set the phone down and walked to the window, pulling back the thin curtain to look out at the parking lot below. A couple was unloading groceries from their car. Normal. Routine. Meanwhile, I just lit a fuse on something that had been building for months. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay on the futon, staring at the ceiling, replaying the look on Sergeant Ramirez's face when Kerr had mocked him. The quiet dignity in his refusal to defend himself. The way the room had watched, some uncomfortable, others amused, but no one stepping in. That was the rot. Not just the cruelty, but the collective tolerance of it. I thought about my father. Retired General Robert Hayes had spent 35 years in the Army, leading soldiers through 2 wars and countless deployments. He'd taught me early that rank wasn't permission to abuse power. It was a responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. When I was 12, he'd taken me to a Veterans Day ceremony where an old sergeant, missing both legs, had spoken about service and sacrifice. My father had stood at attention the entire time, tears streaming down his face. Afterward, he'd looked at me and said something I never forgot. The day you forget what these men and women gave up is the day you stop deserving to lead them. I hadn't forgotten. And I wouldn't start now. Morning came too quickly. I showered, dressed in my uniform, and drove back through the gates of Fort Davidson like I had every other day. But something had shifted. I could feel it the moment I walked into the administrative office. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Eyes tracked me across the room. People who'd never paid attention to me before were suddenly very aware of my presence. Lieutenant Brennan was standing by the coffee maker when I walked in. He glanced at me, then quickly looked away, busying himself with stirring sugar into his cup. No smirk this time. No casual arrogance. Just avoidance. I sat down at my desk and logged into my computer, pulling up the duty roster like it was any other morning. But my inbox was already filling with messages. Most were routine. A few were not. One caught my attention immediately. It was from Major Foster, subject line formal and cold. Lieutenant Hayes, report to my office at 0900 hours. I read it twice, then closed the email without responding. She could wait. At 8:30, I made my way to the break room. The same faded motivational poster still hung on the wall, the same burnt coffee smell filled the air. I poured myself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching the door. It didn't take long. Within 5 minutes, 3 different soldiers had walked in, grabbed what they needed, and left without a word. But their glances lingered. Curious. Cautious. Respectful, maybe. One young specialist, a woman I'd seen around the motor pool, paused on her way out. She looked at me, hesitated, then spoke quietly. "What you did last night, ma'am. That took guts." I nodded once, keeping my expression neutral. He deserved better than what he got. She smiled, just barely. A lot of us think so too. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with my coffee and the steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. At 0900 hours sharp, I knocked on Major Foster's door. Her voice came through, clipped and impatient. "Enter." I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. Foster sat behind her desk, hands folded, her expression carefully controlled. She didn't invite me to sit. "Lieutenant Hayes. Last night's incident has been brought to my attention." I stood at parade rest, hands behind my back. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You confronted a superior officer in a public setting. You questioned his judgment and undermined his authority in front of subordinates and peers. Do you understand how serious that is?" "I do, ma'am." She waited, clearly expecting me to say more. When I didn't, she leaned forward. "Captain Kerr has filed a formal complaint. He's requesting disciplinary action. Insubordination. Conduct unbecoming. This could end your career." I met her gaze without flinching. "With respect, ma'am, Captain Kerr publicly humiliated a Purple Heart recipient. His conduct violated Army values and set a standard that undermines unit cohesion. If anyone's career should be in question, it's his." Foster's jaw tightened. "You're a lieutenant. You don't get to make that call." "No, ma'am," I said evenly. "But someone does." Silence stretched between us, thick and tense. Finally, Foster sat back in her chair, studying me like I was a problem she couldn't quite solve. "You're new here, Lieutenant. You don't understand how things work yet. Captain Kerr is a good officer. He's under a lot of stress. Sometimes people say things they don't mean." I kept my voice calm, measured. "Disrespect isn't a stress response, ma'am. It's a choice." Her expression hardened. "You're dismissed. Consider this a warning. Stay in your lane." I saluted, turned, and walked out. My hands were steady now. Whatever consequences were coming, I'd earned them. And I'd do it again. The rest of the day passed in a strange fog. I went through the motions, filing reports, answering emails, pretending everything was normal. But the undercurrent was there, subtle and persistent. Whispers in the hallway. Glances that lasted a beat too long. The base had always felt like a machine, predictable and impersonal. Now it felt alive, aware, watching to see what would happen next. That afternoon, I found myself back in the supply room. Sergeant Ramirez was there, organizing inventory with the same quiet focus he always had. He looked up when I walked in, nodded, then went back to his work. I hesitated, then spoke. "Sergeant, I wanted to check in. Make sure you're okay after last night." He paused, setting down the clipboard he'd been holding. "Appreciate that, ma'am. I'm fine. You shouldn't have had to hear that." He shrugged, a small, tired gesture. "Wasn't the first time. Won't be the last." That shouldn't be acceptable. Ramirez looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tighten. Weariness. Resignation. The kind that came from years of being dismissed and overlooked. With respect, ma'am, I learned a long time ago that fighting every battle just wears you down. Sometimes it's easier to let it go. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. That silence only protected the people doing harm. But I didn't. Because I understood. He'd spent decades navigating a system that didn't always protect people like him. He'd learned to survive by staying small, by not making waves. And who was I to judge that? Instead, I just nodded. If that changes, Sergeant, if you ever want to speak up, there are people who will listen. He gave me a long look, then nodded back. I'll keep that in mind, ma'am. I left the supply room feeling heavier than when I'd entered. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about a culture that had taught good soldiers to accept mistreatment as the cost of serving. And that was something no after-action report could fully capture. That evening, I met Captain Malik Jefferson for dinner at a small diner off base. Malik was one of the few officers at Fort Davidson I trusted. We'd crossed paths during a training exercise 2 months ago, and he'd struck me as steady, principled, the kind of leader who actually cared about the people under his command. He didn't know my real rank, but he knew I wasn't like the others. He was already sitting in a booth when I arrived, nursing a cup of coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up and waved me over. I slid into the seat across from him, ordered a water from the waitress, and waited. Malik set his phone down and leaned back, studying me. So, you're the talk of the base. I raised an eyebrow. That was fast. He laughed, short and dry. Are you kidding? By noon, half the NCOs knew what you said to Kerr. By 1700, it was on every group chat. You're either the bravest lieutenant I've ever met or the most reckless. Maybe both. He shook his head, but he was smiling. For what it's worth, you did the right thing. Kerr's been running his mouth for years. Someone needed to check him. I sipped my water, considering my next words carefully. What's the word from the command? Malik's smile faded. Foster's pissed. Kerr's pushing for formal action. And from what I hear, the battalion commander is staying out of it, which means nothing's going to happen unless someone forces his hand. I nodded slowly. Typical. Malik leaned forward, lowering his voice. Look, I don't know what your play is here, but you need to be careful. Kerr has friends. People who'll back him just because he's senior. If you push this, it could get ugly. I met his eyes. It's already ugly, Malik. I'm just making sure people see it. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. All right. Just know you're not alone in this. There are others who feel the same way. We're just waiting for someone to lead the charge. That night, back in my apartment, I opened my laptop and pulled up the secure server. I'd been documenting everything since I arrived. Incident reports. Recorded conversations. Patterns of behavior. But now I added something new. A detailed account of the confrontation at the officers' club. The words Kerr had used. The reactions of those present. The silence that followed. I typed slowly, carefully, making sure every detail was accurate. Because this wasn't just about defending Sergeant Ramirez anymore. It was about proving that the system could still work, that accountability was still possible, even when it was uncomfortable. When I finished, I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I hit send. The response came 3 hours later. Colonel Owens again, her message brief but decisive. Phase 2 approved. Prepare for full operational disclosure. Timeline, 72 hours. I read it twice, then closed the laptop. 72 hours. 3 days. Then everyone would know who I really was, and the reckoning would begin. I didn't sleep much that night either. I kept thinking about Sergeant Ramirez. About my father. About every soldier who'd ever been silenced or dismissed or told their service didn't matter. This wasn't about me. It had never been about me. It was about them. And I wasn't going to let them down. The next morning, I walked into the administrative office and got back to work. Filing reports. Answering emails. Playing the role of a forgettable lieutenant just a little bit longer. But now, every interaction felt different. Every conversation was weighted with knowing what was coming. Lieutenant Brennan walked past my desk, glanced at me, then quickly looked away. Major Foster sent another email, this one requesting a follow-up meeting. I ignored it. Captain Kerr, from what I heard, had been ranting to anyone who would listen about insubordinate junior officers who didn't understand the chain of command. Let him rant. In 3 days, he'd understand just how badly he'd miscalculated. That afternoon, I saw Sergeant Ramirez again. He was walking across the parade grounds, head down, shoulders squared. I watched him from a distance, this man who'd given so much and asked for so little in return. He had no idea what was about to happen. None of them did. But they would soon. And when they did, the entire structure they'd built on disrespect and impunity would come crashing down. I turned and walked back into the building, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The countdown had started. 72 hours until the truth came out. 72 hours until everyone learned that the quiet lieutenant they'd ignored was a major general. And 72 hours until I made sure that people like Captain Brandon Kerr never treated another soldier the way he treated Sergeant Ramirez. The storm was coming. And I was bringing it with me. The second day of the countdown began with rain. Not the gentle kind, but the heavy, drumming type that turned the roads slick and made visibility drop to almost nothing. I sat in my car outside Fort Davidson's main gate, windshield wipers working overtime, watching the steady stream of headlights pass through the checkpoint. Everyone going about their routines. Unaware. I pulled through security, showed my ID to the guard who barely glanced at it, and parked in my usual spot near the administrative building. The rain hadn't let up. I grabbed my cover and made a run for the entrance, boots splashing through puddles that had already formed in the uneven pavement. Inside, the building smelled like wet concrete and stale air. I shook off the rain and headed toward my desk, passing clusters of soldiers huddled near doorways, waiting for the downpour to ease. Nobody paid me any attention. Just another lieutenant trying to stay dry. I'd barely sat down when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I opened it cautiously. The message was brief. Motor pool. 15 minutes. Come alone. No signature. No context. I stared at the screen, running through possibilities. It could be a setup. Could be Kerr trying to escalate things on his terms. Or it could be someone with information I needed. Either way, I wasn't going to ignore it. I grabbed my rain jacket and headed back out into the weather. The motor pool was a 10-minute walk across the base, a sprawling area filled with tactical vehicles, maintenance bays, and the constant smell of diesel and grease. By the time I arrived, my uniform was soaked through despite the jacket. The bay doors were open, and inside I could see the dim glow of work lights. I stepped in, water dripping from my sleeves, and scanned the space. Rows of vehicles in various states of repair. Tool chests lining the walls. And there, standing near a Humvee with its hood propped open, was Staff Sergeant Elena Vargas. I'd seen her around before. Quiet, competent, the kind of NCO who kept things running without needing recognition. She looked up when I approached, her expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Hayes," she said, her voice low. "Thanks for coming." I stopped a few feet away, keeping my posture neutral. "You wanted to talk." Vargas glanced over her shoulder, checking to make sure we were alone, then turned back to me. "What you did at the officers' club. Word got around. Fast. I figured it would." She hesitated, like she was weighing her next words carefully. "There are things happening on this base that people don't talk about. Not officially. But everyone knows." I waited, letting her continue at her own pace. Captain Kerr isn't just loud and disrespectful, she said. He's dangerous. Last year, a private first class in his section tried to file a complaint about working conditions. Unsafe practices, equipment that wasn't being maintained properly. 2 weeks later, that soldier was reassigned to a different unit. No explanation. No follow-up. The complaint disappeared. I felt my jaw tighten. Who handled the complaint? Major Foster, Vargas said. She took the statement, said she'd investigate. Nothing happened. And when the soldier pushed back, asking for updates, suddenly there were performance issues. Counseling statements. A pattern of documentation that made it look like the problem was the soldier, not the leadership. Classic retaliation, I said quietly. Vargas nodded. It's not just him. There are others. Soldiers who've been pushed out, transferred, buried under paperwork because they spoke up. And the officers who could do something about it either don't care or are too scared to act. Why are you telling me this? She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes sharp and steady. Because you're the first officer I've seen in a long time who's willing to stand up. And because if you're going to keep pushing, you need to know what you're up against. I appreciated the warning, even if it wasn't telling me anything I hadn't already suspected. Do you have documentation? Names, dates, specifics? Vargas reached into her pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. She held it out to me. Everything I could find. Copies of complaints that were filed and then scrubbed from the system. Emails. Text messages. It's not complete, but it's enough to show the pattern. I took the drive, feeling its weight in my palm. This is risky for you. She shrugged. I've been in 14 years. I didn't join to watch good soldiers get destroyed by bad leaders. If this helps, it's worth it. I slipped the drive into my pocket. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. This matters. Vargas nodded once, then turned back to the Humvee like the conversation had never happened. I walked back out into the rain, my mind already processing what I'd just learned. The pattern was bigger than I'd thought. More systematic. More deliberate. Back in my apartment that evening, I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. The files loaded slowly, folders within folders, each one labeled with names and dates. I opened the first one. A scanned complaint form from 8 months ago. A specialist reporting that Captain Kerr had ordered maintenance on a vehicle without proper safety protocols, putting soldiers at risk. The complaint had been filed with Major Foster. The follow-up section was blank. I opened another file. An email chain between soldiers discussing how to report issues without getting targeted. One message stood out. Don't bother going through official channels. They protect each other. You'll just end up with a target on your back. I kept reading. More complaints. More retaliation. A pattern so clear it was almost insulting that no one had acted on it before. But that was the problem with toxic leadership. It thrived in silence. It relied on people being too afraid to speak up, too worn down to fight back. I uploaded everything to the secure server, adding my own notes and cross-references. Colonel Owens would see it by morning. And when she did, the timeline might accelerate even faster. The next day, I went back to work like nothing had changed. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. I could feel it in the way people moved through the hallways, the way conversations dropped off when I walked past. Word was spreading. Not just about the confrontation, but about something bigger. People were starting to ask questions. I was at my desk, typing up a routine report, when Lieutenant Brennan approached. He looked nervous, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his usual swagger completely absent. Lieutenant Hayes, he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. Can I talk to you for a second? I looked up, keeping my expression neutral. Go ahead. He glanced around, making sure no one was listening. Look, about the other night. At the officers' club. I just wanted to say I didn't know it was going to go that far. Kerr was drunk and he gets like that sometimes. I shouldn't have laughed. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. But you did laugh. Brennan shifted uncomfortably. Yeah. I did. And that was wrong. Sergeant Ramirez is a good guy. He didn't deserve that. No, he didn't, I said evenly. So what are you going to do about it? He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What do you mean? I mean you have a choice, Lieutenant. You can keep going along with people like Kerr, laughing at the wrong things, staying silent when it matters. Or you can decide to be a different kind of officer. Brennan stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll think about that. He walked away, and I went back to my report. Small moments like that mattered. Not everyone was too far gone. Some people just needed to see that standing up was possible. That afternoon, Captain Malik Jefferson found me in the break room. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, his expression serious. You hear about the meeting? He asked. I shook my head. What meeting? Battalion commander called an all-hands formation for tomorrow morning. 0800. Mandatory attendance. No exceptions. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. That's fast. Malik took a sip of his coffee, watching me over the rim of the cup. Word is, someone from higher up is coming to address the command. Nobody knows who or why, but the timing is suspicious. I kept my face blank, but my mind was racing. Colonel Owens must have moved the timeline up. Phase 2 was happening sooner than expected. Tomorrow morning, everything would come to light. Any idea what it's about? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Malik shrugged. Officially? No. Unofficially? People are saying it has something to do with the incident at the officers' club. Some are saying there's an investigation. Others think it's just damage control. I nodded slowly, processing. What do you think? He set his cup down and looked at me directly. I think someone finally decided to do something about the rot. And I think you had something to do with it. I didn't confirm or deny. I just held his gaze. If that's true, would you have a problem with it? Malik smiled, just a little. Not even a little bit. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the lights off, staring out the window at the parking lot below. The rain had finally stopped, leaving everything slick and reflective under the streetlights. My phone sat on the table beside me, silent. No new messages. No updates. Just the waiting. I thought about Sergeant Ramirez. About Staff Sergeant Vargas. About all the soldiers who'd been pushed down, pushed out, pushed aside by people who saw rank as permission instead of responsibility. Tomorrow, that would start to change. Tomorrow, the people who'd spent months hiding behind their positions would have to answer for it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. But beneath the exhaustion was something solid and unshakable. Purpose. This was why I'd agreed to go undercover in the first place. Not for the thrill of deception, but for moments like this. Moments when the system could still work if someone was willing to push it. My phone buzzed. A message from Colonel Owens. Brief and to the point. 0730. Be ready. I replied with a single word. Roger. Then I stood up, walked to the closet, and pulled out the garment bag I'd kept hidden in the back. Inside was my service uniform. The real one. 2 silver stars gleaming on the shoulder boards. Ribbons earned over 2 decades of service. The weight of rank I'd carried long before I ever walked through the gates of Fort Davidson. I hung the uniform on the back of the door and stared at it for a long time. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be Lieutenant Hayes anymore. Tomorrow, I'd be Major General Victoria Hayes. And everyone who dismissed me, ignored me, underestimated me, would learn exactly who they'd been dealing with. I went to bed early but didn't sleep much. My mind kept running through scenarios, contingencies, the faces of the people who'd be standing in that formation when the truth came out. Kerr's arrogance. Foster's calculated indifference. The soldiers who'd been suffering in silence, waiting for someone to care. By 0600, I was awake and dressed. Not in my lieutenant's uniform, but in the one that reflected my actual rank. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my cover, checking my appearance with the same attention to detail I'd maintained for years. The woman staring back at me looked different. Not because of the uniform, but because the mask was finally coming off. I grabbed my keys, locked the apartment behind me, and drove to Fort Davidson one last time as someone nobody knew. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The base was already stirring, soldiers moving toward the parade grounds where the formation would take place. I parked in a different lot this time, away from my usual spot, and made my way toward the administrative building where I was supposed to meet Colonel Owens. She was already there, standing near the entrance, her uniform crisp and her expression calm. "General Hayes," she said, her voice formal but warm. "It's good to see you back in the right uniform." I nodded. "It's good to be back, Colonel." She handed me a folder. "This contains the executive summary of your findings. The Inspector General's office has reviewed everything. We're prepared to move forward with formal charges against Captain Kerr and an administrative investigation into Major Foster's handling of complaints. There will also be a broader review of command climate across the battalion." I took the folder, flipping through it briefly. The evidence was damning. Timelines. Patterns. Names. Everything I'd been documenting for 3 months, now formatted into an official report that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. "What about Sergeant Ramirez?" I asked. Colonel Owens smiled slightly. "He's been notified that he'll be receiving a formal commendation for his service and an apology from the command. He doesn't know the details yet, but he will soon." "Good," I said quietly. "He deserves that." Owens checked her watch. "Formation starts in 20 minutes. The battalion commander knows you're coming, but no one else does. When you step onto that platform, it's going to send shockwaves through the entire base." I looked toward the parade grounds, already filling with soldiers standing in neat rows, waiting for whatever announcement was about to come. "Let them be shocked," I said. "It's time they understood that accountability isn't optional." Colonel Owens nodded. "Then let's go remind them what leadership looks like." We walked together toward the parade grounds, the morning air cool and still. I could see the formation taking shape, hundreds of soldiers standing at attention, their faces forward, their postures disciplined. At the front, near the raised platform, stood the battalion commander, Major Foster, Captain Kerr, and several other officers. Kerr was talking to someone, gesturing with his hands, his expression animated. He hadn't noticed me yet. None of them had. I was just another figure approaching from a distance, unremarkable in the early morning light. But that was about to change. In a few minutes, I would step onto that platform. I would speak my rank and my name. And the entire foundation they'd built on arrogance and impunity would begin to crumble. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and kept walking. The reckoning had arrived. The formation stretched across the parade grounds in precise rows, over 300 soldiers standing at attention under the brightening morning sky. Their boots were polished, uniforms pressed, faces forward. The usual pre-formation chatter had died down to nothing. Something about the atmosphere told them this wasn't routine. I stood behind the administrative building with Colonel Owens, out of sight from the assembled troops. From this angle, I could see the platform where the battalion commander stood reviewing notes, flanked by his staff. Major Foster was there, her posture rigid, arms crossed. Captain Kerr stood slightly apart, checking his phone, clearly bored. Lieutenant Brennan hovered near the edge, looking uncomfortable. Colonel Owens glanced at her watch. 2 minutes. Once you step out there, there's no going back. "I know," I said quietly. She studied me for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've handled this operation with exceptional discipline, General. A lot of officers would have broken cover the first week. You lasted 3 months. I kept my eyes on the formation. It wasn't about lasting. It was about seeing the whole picture. Understanding how deep it went. And now you have that picture, she said. The question is, are you ready for what comes next? Because once your rank is revealed, every decision you made while undercover will be scrutinized. Every conversation. Every interaction. They'll question your methods. Let them question, I replied. The evidence speaks for itself. Owens nodded slowly. Then let's make sure they hear it. The battalion commander stepped up to the microphone, his voice carrying across the parade grounds through speakers mounted on poles. Good morning, soldiers. Thank you for assembling on short notice. We have an important announcement this morning, and I ask for your full attention and professionalism. The formation remained still, hundreds of eyes locked forward. The commander cleared his throat, glancing down at his notes. As many of you are aware, there have been recent incidents on this installation that have raised concerns about leadership and command climate. In response, Higher Headquarters has been conducting a comprehensive review of operations here at Fort Davidson. I saw Kerr stiffen slightly, his phone disappearing into his pocket. Foster's expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. The commander continued. To address these concerns and ensure accountability at all levels, we have a senior officer joining us this morning. I ask that you render appropriate courtesy. He stepped back from the microphone and turned toward the side of the platform where Colonel Owens and I stood waiting. She nodded to me once. It was time. I stepped out from behind the building and began walking toward the platform. The early morning light caught the 2 silver stars on my shoulders, reflecting in brief flashes. I kept my stride measured, confident, my cover squared perfectly on my head. I didn't look at the formation yet. I kept my eyes on the platform ahead. The first person to notice was a young sergeant in the front row. I saw his eyes widen, saw him do a double take as he processed what he was seeing. Then the realization rippled backward through the formation like a wave. Whispers started, quickly suppressed. Officers on the platform turned to see what had caused the disturbance. Major Foster saw me first. Her face went pale, eyes widening in shock. She took an involuntary step backward, nearly stumbling. Captain Kerr followed her gaze, and I watched the color drain from his face as he registered the rank on my shoulders. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Lieutenant Brennan just stared, frozen in place. I climbed the steps to the platform, my boots solid against the wood. The battalion commander snapped to attention and saluted. I returned it crisply. The entire formation followed suit, hundreds of hands moving in unison, the sound of their movement like a sharp breath. Major General Victoria Hayes, the commander, announced into the microphone, his voice carrying a tremor he couldn't quite hide. Commander, 3rd Army Inspector General Investigation Team. I stepped up to the microphone, taking a moment to look out across the formation. Faces I'd seen every day for 3 months. Soldiers who'd walked past me without a second glance. NCOs who'd treated me like furniture. Officers who'd dismissed my presence entirely. At ease, I said. The formation shifted, hands dropping to their sides, but the tension remained thick. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting them absorb what they were seeing. Then I began. For the past 3 months, I have been assigned to this installation under the operational authority of the Inspector General. My mission was to conduct an undercover assessment of leadership practices, command climate, and adherence to Army values at Fort Davidson. The formation was absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. During that time, I observed and documented behaviors that violate both the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the fundamental principles this institution was built on. I witnessed retaliation against soldiers who raised legitimate concerns. I documented patterns of abuse of authority. And I personally experienced the culture of disrespect that has been allowed to fester here. I saw Kerr shift his weight, his face now flushed red. Foster stared straight ahead, her expression carefully blank, but I could see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. 3 nights ago, I continued, I witnessed a senior officer publicly mock and humiliate a decorated combat veteran. A soldier who earned his Purple Heart pulling wounded men from a burning vehicle under enemy fire. That officer used his position to belittle a man who has given more to this country than most of us will ever be asked to give. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle. I heard someone in the formation whisper Sergeant Ramirez. The name spread quietly through the ranks. That incident was not isolated, I said. It was symptomatic of a larger problem. A command environment where cruelty is tolerated, where soldiers are punished for speaking truth, and where rank is wielded as a weapon rather than a responsibility. I turned slightly, looking directly at Captain Kerr. He was sweating now, his hands clenched at his sides. Captain Brandon Kerr. Step forward. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, stiffly, mechanically, he walked to the center of the platform. His face was a mixture of rage and fear. You are hereby relieved of your duties as logistics officer, effective immediately, I said, my voice clear and cold. You will report to the JAG office at 0900 hours to receive formal notification of charges being brought against you under Article 92 for dereliction of duty, Article 133 for conduct unbecoming an officer, and Article 134 for actions prejudicial to good order and discipline. Kerr opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it. His hands trembled. Dismissed, I said. He saluted, the motion jerky and uncertain, then walked off the platform. I watched him go, his stride uneven, his shoulders hunched. No swagger now. No arrogance. Just a man finally facing consequences. I turned back to the formation. Major Diane Foster. Step forward. Foster moved slowly, her face ashen. She stopped beside me, standing at rigid attention. You are being placed on administrative suspension pending investigation into your handling of complaints filed by soldiers under your purview, I said. Evidence suggests you knowingly suppressed reports of misconduct and engaged in retaliatory action against soldiers who came forward. You will surrender your duties to your deputy and report for an initial inquiry at 1400 hours. Foster's voice came out thin and strained. Yes, ma'am. Dismissed. She saluted and stepped down, her movements stiff. I didn't watch her leave. I turned back to the formation, scanning the faces. Shock. Disbelief. And in some eyes, something that looked like relief. Let me be clear, I said. This is not a witch hunt. This is accountability. Every charge being brought is supported by evidence. Every action taken today is lawful and justified. But more than that, it is necessary. I took a breath, choosing my next words carefully. Some of you have served honorably here despite the environment. Some of you have tried to do the right thing and been punished for it. To those soldiers, I want you to know that your service has not gone unnoticed. Your courage matters. And from this day forward, the standard will be different. I saw heads nod in the formation. Subtle, but unmistakable. To those who have remained silent while witnessing misconduct, I continued, understand that silence is complicity. You have a duty not just to follow orders, but to uphold the values this uniform represents. If you see something wrong, you are obligated to speak up. Not because it's easy, but because it's right. The battalion commander stood beside me, his face pale, clearly uncertain whether he was next on the list. He wasn't. His failure was one of oversight, not malice. But he would have to answer questions about how things had gotten this bad under his watch. I turned to face him directly. Commander, you will conduct a full unit climate survey within the next 30 days. You will establish a direct reporting channel for complaints that bypasses the normal chain of command. And you will attend mandatory leadership training along with every officer on this installation. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am, he said quickly. Absolutely. Good, I said. Then let's start rebuilding trust. I stepped back from the microphone and addressed the formation one last time. You are dismissed. Section leaders, return to your duty stations and continue mission essential operations. All officers, remain in place. We have additional guidance to cover. The enlisted soldiers began to file out, their movements orderly but buzzing with energy. I could hear the whispers starting already, the rapid exchange of reactions. Within an hour, every corner of the base would know what had happened. By afternoon, it would be spreading across social media, military forums, group chats. The officers remained standing in an awkward cluster near the platform. Lieutenants, captains, a few majors. All of them looked uncertain, exposed, suddenly very aware that their actions had been watched far more closely than they'd realized. Colonel Owens stepped forward and took the microphone. "All right, listen up. Over the next 72 hours, each of you will be interviewed by members of the IG team. These are not punitive interviews unless evidence of wrongdoing emerges. They are designed to gather information about command climate and leadership practices. You are expected to answer truthfully and completely. Failure to do so will result in additional charges." She let that sink in before continuing. "Additionally, all current counseling statements, performance evaluations, and administrative actions taken within the last 18 months will be reviewed for potential bias or retaliation. If you have taken action against a soldier that you now believe may have been unjust, I strongly encourage you to come forward voluntarily." I watched their faces. Some looked relieved. Others looked terrified. A few looked angry, like they couldn't believe this was happening to them. Lieutenant Brennan caught my eye. He looked like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. I gave him a small nod. Not forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. He'd have to decide for himself what kind of officer he wanted to be going forward. The officers were dismissed, and they scattered quickly, most heading straight for their offices or vehicles, likely to make phone calls or send messages to whoever they thought could help them. It wouldn't matter. The process was already in motion. Colonel Owens walked over to me as the parade grounds emptied. "That went about as well as it could have." "Kerr looked like he was going to pass out," I said. She smiled grimly. "Good. Maybe fear will teach him what decency couldn't." "What about Foster?" Owens pulled out her tablet, scrolling through notes. "We have 14 separate complaints that she either ignored or actively suppressed. 5 soldiers were transferred or chaptered out under questionable circumstances after filing those complaints. She's done. Even if the criminal charges don't stick, her career is over." I nodded. "And Ramirez?" "He's been notified to report to the commander's office at 1000 hours, Owens said. "He'll receive a formal apology and a commendation. We're also reviewing his case to see if there are any benefits or recognitions he was denied due to the toxic environment. Make sure he knows he didn't do anything wrong," I said quietly. "Men like him internalize this kind of treatment. He needs to hear that it wasn't his fault." Owens met my eyes. "I'll make sure of it." We stood there for a moment, watching the last few soldiers leave the parade grounds. The sun was fully up now, the morning cold burning off into what would probably be a clear day. "What happens to you now?" Owens asked. "Back to your actual assignment?" "Eventually," I said. "But first, I'm going to sit in on every one of those interviews. I want to hear what they say. I want to see their faces when they realize they can't hide anymore." She nodded. I expected nothing less. That afternoon, I sat in a small conference room in the JAG building, a notepad in front of me, a cup of terrible coffee cooling at my elbow. Across the table sat a young captain I'd seen around the motor pool. His name was Douglas, and he looked like he was about to be sick. "Captain Douglas," I said calmly. "You understand you're here voluntarily and that this conversation is part of the command climate assessment?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to walk me through your interactions with Captain Kerr over the past year. Specifically, any instances where you witnessed or were told about inappropriate conduct." Douglas swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "There were a lot of instances, ma'am." "Take your time," I said. "Start with the earliest one you remember." He began talking, slowly at first, then faster as the words tumbled out. Stories of Kerr berating soldiers in front of their peers. Of him refusing to approve legitimate maintenance requests because he didn't feel like dealing with paperwork. Of him making crude jokes about female soldiers and daring anyone to report him. I listened without interrupting, taking notes, my face neutral. When he finished, I looked up. Did you ever report any of this? Douglas shook his head, shame written across his face. I thought about it. But I saw what happened to people who did. They got labeled as troublemakers. Their careers stalled. I have a family, ma'am. I couldn't risk it. I set my pen down. I understand the fear. But you need to understand something, Captain. Every day you stayed silent, more soldiers suffered. That's not an accusation. It's a fact. And now you have to decide whether you're going to keep living with that or whether you're going to be part of fixing it. He nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. I want to fix it, ma'am. I do. Then start by telling the truth, I said. All of it. No matter how uncomfortable. The interviews went on for hours. One after another, officers came in and told their stories. Some were defensive, trying to justify their inaction. Others were remorseful, realizing too late that they'd been complicit. A few were defiant, insisting that this was all overblown, that soldiers today were too soft, that real leadership required toughness. I listened to all of them. And I documented every word. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Hearing the depth of the dysfunction, the layers of failure, was draining. But it was also clarifying. This was why the work mattered. This was why I'd spent 3 months pretending to be someone else. Colonel Owens found me as I was packing up my notes. How are you holding up? I'm fine, I said. Just tired. You should be proud, she said. What you uncovered here is going to lead to systemic changes. Not just at Fort Davidson, but across the force. I hope so, I said. Because if it doesn't, then all of this was for nothing. That night, I drove back to my small apartment one last time. Tomorrow, I'd move into quarters appropriate for my rank. But tonight, I wanted to sit in this space that had been my cover for 3 months and let it all sink in. I sat on the futon, staring at the bare walls, thinking about Sergeant Ramirez. About Staff Sergeant Vargas. About all the soldiers who'd been carrying the weight of this broken system. They deserved better. And now, finally, they were going to get it. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I opened it cautiously. The message was simple. Thank you, ma'am. From all of us. No name. No signature. But I knew who it was from. The soldiers who'd been suffering in silence. The ones who'd finally been heard. I typed a reply. You don't need to thank me. You earned this by not giving up. I hit send and set the phone down. The reckoning was underway. And there was no stopping it now. 6 weeks had passed since the formation on the parade grounds. Fort Davidson looked the same from the outside, same buildings, same roads, same morning formations. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. I stood in my new office, considerably larger than the cramped desk I'd occupied as a lieutenant, and watched through the window as soldiers moved through their daily routines. The morning air was crisp, autumn beginning to settle in with golden leaves scattered across the walkways. My desk held a stack of reports, each one detailing the progress of reforms implemented across the installation. Mandatory leadership training had been completed by every officer. A new reporting system for complaints was operational, bypassing traditional chains of command and going directly to an independent review board. 3 additional officers had been relieved of duty after the investigations uncovered patterns of misconduct. Captain Kerr had been court-martialed 2 weeks ago. The proceedings had been swift and thorough. Witnesses testified about years of abuse, retaliation, and toxic leadership. He'd been found guilty on all charges, reduced in rank, and separated from service with an other than honorable discharge. His military career was over. Major Foster had accepted a plea agreement. In exchange for her cooperation with ongoing investigations, she'd been allowed to resign her commission rather than face court-martial. She was gone now, her name scrubbed from the duty roster, her office reassigned. The battalion commander remained in place, but under much closer scrutiny. He'd been formally counseled and placed on a performance improvement plan. Whether he survived would depend on his ability to actually lead rather than simply manage. A knock on my door pulled me from my thoughts. "Come in." Sergeant First Class Thomas Ramirez entered, his posture straight, his uniform immaculate. He stopped at the appropriate distance and saluted. "Ma'am, you asked to see me?" I returned the salute and gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please, Sergeant. Have a seat." He sat carefully, his hands resting on his knees, his expression neutral but cautious. I'd requested this meeting a week ago, wanting to speak with him privately once the immediate chaos had settled. "I want to thank you for your patience during this process," I began. "I know the past several weeks have been difficult, and I appreciate your professionalism throughout." Ramirez nodded slowly. "It's been an adjustment, ma'am. A lot of people suddenly wanting to shake my hand and apologize. Feels strange." "I imagine it does," I said. "But those apologies are owed. What happened to you should never have occurred." He looked down at his hands, weathered and scarred from years of hard work. "With respect, ma'am, it wasn't the first time. And if you hadn't been there, it wouldn't have been the last." "That's exactly why I wanted to talk with you," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You've given 26 years to this army. You've served with distinction, earned the respect of everyone who's actually worked with you, and carried yourself with more integrity than most officers I've met. And for too long, that service was overlooked and disrespected." He met my eyes, something unreadable in his expression. "I never expected recognition, ma'am. I just did my job." "I know," I said quietly. "But that's not good enough. You shouldn't have to accept disrespect as the price of serving. None of our soldiers should." Ramirez was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "What you did, going undercover like that, putting yourself in that position. Why?" "Because the system only works if people are willing to hold it accountable," I said. "And because soldiers like you deserve leaders who actually lead." He nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing his face. "Well, you definitely shook things up, ma'am." "That was the goal," I replied. "But shaking things up isn't enough. Real change requires follow-through. Which brings me to why I asked you here." I pulled a folder from my desk and slid it across to him. "Inside, you'll find orders assigning you to the Warrior Transition Battalion as a senior mentor for wounded and recovering soldiers. It's a position that requires someone with your experience, your compassion, and your ability to connect with soldiers who've been through combat trauma." Ramirez opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. His eyebrows raised slightly. "Ma'am, this is typically reserved for senior NCOs with another rank higher than mine." "It is," I said. "Which is why the second document in that folder is your promotion packet. You're being advanced to Master Sergeant, effective immediately. You should have been promoted years ago, but the environment here prevented it. We're correcting that now." He stared at the papers, his jaw working silently. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I told him. "Just keep doing what you've always done. Serve with honor. Take care of soldiers. Show them what right looks like." He stood, squaring his shoulders, and saluted with more precision than I'd seen from officers twice his rank. "Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down." "You never have, Sergeant," I said, returning the salute. After he left, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Not triumph. Just the steady calm of knowing something broken had been fixed, at least partially. My phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Owens. Final audit complete. 17 cases of retaliation identified and reversed. 12 soldiers receiving back pay and restored evaluations. Fort Davidson officially cleared for operational status. I typed a response. Good work. What's next? Her reply came quickly. You tell me, General. Where does the Inspector General's office need you next? I looked out the window again, watching a young private help an older sergeant carry equipment across the yard. Neither of them knew I was watching. They were just doing their jobs, taking care of each other the way soldiers should. Wherever the standards are slipping, I typed back. Wherever people think rank makes them untouchable. That's where I need to be. Understood, Owens replied. Stand by for orders. I set the phone down and pulled up the final report I'd been drafting, the comprehensive assessment that would be distributed throughout the Army as a case study. Not just about what went wrong at Fort Davidson, but about how it was corrected. How accountability could still work when people were willing to enforce it. The title at the top of the document read, Leadership Accountability and Organizational Culture, Lessons from Fort Davidson. I began typing the conclusion, choosing each word carefully. Toxic leadership does not develop overnight. It is the result of systemic failures in accountability, where individuals in positions of authority are allowed to abuse their power without consequence. The solution is not more policies or more training alone. It is the willingness of leaders at every level to confront misconduct when they see it, regardless of personal cost. This case demonstrates that with proper oversight, documented evidence, and commitment to Army values, even deeply entrenched dysfunction can be addressed and corrected. I saved the document and closed my laptop. The work here was done. Soon I'd receive new orders, a new assignment, likely another base where problems had been allowed to fester. And I'd do it again, because that was the job. But tonight, I'd allow myself to feel what I'd accomplished here. Not for my own glory, but for the soldiers who could now serve without fear. For the NCOs who could speak up without retaliation. For the young officers who might actually learn what leadership meant instead of just mimicking the cruelty they'd witnessed. I stood and walked to the window one last time. The sun was setting, painting the base in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere out there, Sergeant Ramirez was probably packing up his office, preparing for his new assignment. Somewhere, soldiers were going home to their families, no longer carrying the weight of a toxic command. And somewhere, an officer who thought rank made them immune to consequences was learning the hardest lesson of all. That the uniform meant something. That honor wasn't negotiable. And that eventually, always, the truth comes out. I picked up my cover, placed it squarely on my head, and walked out of my office. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new assignments, new battles to fight. But tonight, Fort Davidson could finally rest knowing that justice had been served. Not through vengeance. Through accountability. And that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.